We'll jump right in. We are going to kind of pick up the story that we started last week on identity. And we opened up last week just to kind of say, like, let's start with the foundation. Let's start with the very beginning. And then we can kind of build on that. So last week we looked at the creation story. We went all the way back to Genesis. And we started looking at how God created us. We said God created us male and female. And that God, when he created us, he bestowed this a crazy kind of dignity on us as human beings, that we would be set over all of the rest of his creation. Everything else that he'd created, he sets us over that. So he gives us dignity by giving us dominion over everything he created. But he also says, well, hold on, don't get too big for yourself. You are also living under my watchful hand. So we also understand that the first kind of part of our identity is not only we have dignity, but we also live in humility and we submit ourselves to God. So hopefully that's a little bit of a review. So far, just kind of big picture identity, as far as we've gotten in the story right now, is simply, hey, you have a creator. You have a creator. He created you with purpose and with dignity, and we are subject to his guiding hand. We are humbling ourselves under his guiding hand. Okay, so for those of you who are like, hey, I'm coming to Crossroads for a little while because I really understand identity. I want to really dig into that and figure out what my own identity is. I know that what we've touched on so far may not be overly helpful yet. Just stick with me. We're gonna get into this, and as we kind of start to build this thing, it's important for us to have that foundation. You have a creator. He created you with purpose and dignity, and we were created to live under his hand in humility. And so that has to be the foundation. I said last week, if you don't know your true identity, then you're going to settle for a false identity every time. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is some false identities that we have settled for, that we have bought into without even really knowing what we were buying into. Because, as I also said last week, culture has distorted this idea of identity for us. It's made it really hard for us to see clearly what God has for us. And so today we're going to try to expose some false identities that maybe culture has put out there and said, this is who you are. We're going to have to do some work to wade through a few bad ideas here and to try to answer a question of biblical identity. And so this is coming from some work that was done. Any Tim Keller fans in the room? Okay, all right, yeah, me too. I love Tim Keller. Anyway, before he died, he did some work on identity, and so this has a lot of roots in that. I'm going to give you 3 ideas today that are actually very much at odds with what the Bible says about our identity. And I want us to be able to recognize them and to see them for what they are, so that we don't, kind of pick them up without knowing, kind of pick them up like a virus and start spreading them around, so we can see this for what it is. So you'll notice as I get into these, over the past, maybe 20, 30 years, you will have seen some of these ideas gain quite a bit more prominence, but then they've kind of come and had their way, and then they faded from prevalence. But I'm going to argue with you this morning to say, like, that doesn't mean that they're gone. Because just because we don't talk that way anymore and because we don't use that kind of language doesn't mean that they're not still part of kind of this false identity that many of us have adopted. And actually, I want to challenge you this morning to think about these things from that perspective. Like, what from these false identities have you incorporated into your own life and lifestyle? And at first blush, you're going to be like, that's not me. That's not me. That's not me. And I'm like, whoa, hold on. It's all of us to some degree. And the deeper we dig into that, I think the more clear that will become. So see if you can kind of see these things in your own life, and then that'll be the first step toward weeding them out. All right, let's jump right in. If you're taking notes today, the first cultural theory of identity, number 1, I am what I acquire. I am what I acquire. And this seems like, at first glance, you're like, oh, yeah, we kind of went through that, didn't we? With the 80s and 90s, kind of that early 2000s, maybe that sort of heyday of like people really saying, oh, it's really important to amass sort of things. I think we've seen our way through that a little bit, but it's still there. So this approach to identity basically says, man, I am what I have, or at least what I can get. And it's not just physical stuff. I'm not talking about just physical things. I am what I have or what I can get. I'm talking about, well, sometimes physical things. So people will kind of pursue money, as part of their identity. And the way that you know that's part of their identity is because they get not only so wrapped up in it that they're willing to maybe sell their soul a little bit for it, but it's something that's constantly their focus, constantly on their mind. It's kind of who they are. Not only money, though, some of the times the things money can acquire, but sometimes it's totally something different. It's not even physical stuff at all. It's things like recognition and prestige. Maybe sometimes for some people, status. I think a lot of times we would like to acquire, especially for those who are younger, maybe in a single stage of life, where they think that if they can acquire a spouse or if they can acquire someone to love them, then they're going to kind of step into that person who they truly are. I was just talking to Frank this morning, and he had that idea too, that when you're young, sometimes you look to groups because you think that your identity is going to be in a group, and you see this sort of clique mentality form. It sticks with us a lot longer than junior high and high school. It actually goes off into adulthood with us. But this idea that, man, if I could just acquire a group around me, then I could find safety, I could find some sort of support system. I am what I acquire. Sometimes we want to acquire good looks, we want to acquire fitness. Listen, these things are not always a problem. It's not like, oh, you should never have any of those things. It's not what I'm saying. They're a problem only when they become tied to your identity. Like when your identity comes from what you have or from what you get, and you don't really know who you are without that thing. And I'm going to dig into this with you in just a second here, and you'll see that maybe it's not quite as far off as you might think. If you have a Bible, you want to open up to Luke chapter 12. I'm going to just show you a quick little, there's a famous parable that Jesus speaks. And I won't read the whole thing, but you'll recognize it for what it is. Luke chapter 12, I'm just going to look at verse 15. Jesus gives us this warning. He says, take care. This is kind of in line with this, I am what I acquire. Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. So covetousness is that desire to just kind of bring things in. Like you see somebody else with it, you see it on an advertisement where you gotta like bring things in, you're coveting. You say, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life, that means your life, who you are, your identity, all this stuff is kind of wrapped into this. Your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. So Jesus sees this thing coming for people. He's like, man, be careful, because you can get yourself wrapped up in this thing. I am what I acquire. So there's a couple of problems with this approach to identity, and it snares us a little easier than we think. But I'll point out a couple of problems with it. The first is what happens to people who have their identity, and you see this happen with people. If you have your identity wrapped up in what you can acquire, then what you see is them sometimes selling their soul, maybe selling their real identity, so that they can get that thing that they want to acquire, so that they can have that. So you see this all the time, where people kind of make this desperate grab for something that they can acquire, and in the process, they lose themselves. So they want, say, money so bad that they're willing to compromise their principles. They're willing to compromise their ethics to get that thing. How many Christian businessmen or businesswomen have sort of foregone some sort of ethic in order to maybe make more money? We kind of let those things slide. We let them slip aside. They've compromised, in a lot of ways, they compromise their true selves, their true identity. I think about young men, young women who are single, maybe some of you in the room, and you think about how easy it is for them to compromise their ideals, their ethics, their own bodies, so that they can get that thing that they want, so they can kind of wrap that in. We think sometimes that is where our identity is found, in that thing that we can acquire, and so we compromise. We try to get it. So we think we're what we acquire, maybe we're what we accomplish. So you think about people who give themselves to their work, and you think about what they like. We're willing to compromise families. We're willing to compromise joy. We're willing to compromise peace. We're willing to kind of sell our souls for that thing that we want. We all know people who have lost themselves in a job, lost themselves in a relationship, and really they haven't found themselves there. They have just lost themselves. They've literally lost themselves. It doesn't work. This idea that we're going to go out and figure out what our identity is by finding something that we can acquire. It doesn't work for a couple different reasons. The first is we start to lose who we are. And so we become different people in different places. You enter a room and you're a different person than maybe you are in a different room because you're constantly willing to compromise who you are so that you can find that thing that you're searching for. Matter of fact, just at its very root, and this is the second fill-in on your sermon notes, identity at its very root is what is consistent about us. Identity is found in what is consistent about us. So you think about your identity and who you are. The things that are most consistent, the word identity comes from a Latin root, idem, which means the same. It means identical. In other words, a huge part of our identity is that we are consistent. And the less consistent we are, the less we know really who we are. It's when we're the same in all situations. So there's nothing that's going to get compromised when I go into this room or this room or this room. There's nothing that's going to change about me because I know who I am. We have that consistency of identity. This is what the psalmist talks about when he says, he's praying to God. He's like, hey, unite my heart. Because our hearts are like pulling us in all kinds of different directions. Teach me your way, O Lord, that I might walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name. Identity is found in what is consistent about us. So kind of thinking about this idea of I am what I acquire. Is there something about you? Is there some set of commitments, of core values, of maybe of goals that just do not change regardless of what you're pursuing? Right? So one of the first problems with this theory of identity, you're going to find your identity in what you can acquire, is that we end up actually losing more of our true identity than we know. That's the first problem. Here's the second problem. The second problem is that anything you can acquire, you can also lose. Right? So some people who find their identity in maybe acquiring status or prestige or a good job, like you may not be a successful CEO forever. There's going to come a time, maybe it's taken from you, maybe you retire out of it, whatever. There's going to come a time when that season in your life is going to come to an end. And if your identity is too much in that thing you've acquired, you may not be a successful, surgeon forever. And when people come to you all the time and they're looking to you and they're looking for your approval and they're looking for, that may not happen forever. And if we have too much of our identity wrapped up in that thing, what's it going to look like when that thing is taken from you? Because anything that you can acquire, you can also lose. I thought about this a lot when Carol and I were kind of wrestling through that time of infertility for us as a couple. I think I've told you this story before, but just about 10 years, where we just couldn't have kids. We tried to talk to doctors. We tried all these different things, and it just wasn't happening. And I can remember this kind of moment of going like, okay, who am I if I'm not a dad? Because I grew up in a big family. I always thought of myself, honestly, I thought of myself as having a big family because we loved our family and we still do. We get along really well. And I kind of had this thought of like, oh, what if that is taken away from me? Is my identity wrapped up in that thing that I can acquire, that thing that I can get? What's going to happen to my identity if that thing falls through? You see this happening all the times with moms who struggle with identity when kids leave the house. Like, if I'm not nurturing, if I'm not caring for, if I'm not taking care of my kids, who am I? You see marriages start to implode with the empty nest, right? They just start to, because now a husband and wife are trying to figure out who they are. You know what else you see? You see the suicide rate start to climb for men especially who have lost a job. The statistics are out there that is a very dangerous time for men because it's like something so core to who they are, something that was tied into who they are. This identity is wrapped up into that. When that thing is taken away from you, you look inside and you find that there's like no you there at all. Like who am I if I lose that? How do I figure that out? Like there's this void inside of me. To build an identity on what you could acquire, it's kind of like building on sand. Jesus talks about building on sand, right? He says it's just not going to last. It's hollow. There's a superficiality to it because it can be taken away. So if we go back to Luke chapter 12, the story of starting in verse 13, I won't read it all, but the story of the guy who builds the barn. Remember that? And he amasses all kinds of wealth, and he starts bringing all this wealth into his barns, and he builds these bigger and bigger barns, and pretty soon so I'll read verse 19. Pretty soon he stands back and he's like, yeah, I made it. Okay, so he says, and I will say to my soul, this guy, he's got all this amassed wealth. I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Right? So this is what kind of like, yes, okay, I've acquired. And then God says to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. This very night, your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will those be? Like you put all this into that thing that you could acquire. Now what's going to happen to it? He says, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So this cultural theory that we buy into sometimes without even really knowing it. Think about your identity as parents. Think about your identity as a worker in an industry. This is my identity. Anything that you can acquire, you'll just end up losing yourself if that becomes a source of your identity. And it's not bad to have those things. It's not bad to be a father. It's not bad to be a mother. It's not bad to have a good job, be a CEO. None of that's bad. Unless it's your identity. And then you're going to run into problems with it. You're going to run into problems because it's not the highest source of your identity. So theory number one, people are what they can acquire. I am what I can acquire. It doesn't work. But there's a second theory of identity here that is going to sound a lot more familiar to you today. I think it's much more prominent nowadays. And at first, you're going to kind of look at it and chuckle and say, yeah, that's not me. It's all of us. So just get through with that. Here we go. Number two, cultural theory number two, I am what I feel. I am what I feel. So this is not, hard work. It's not accomplishment. It's not money. It's not none of those things. The important thing here is that you would just get in touch with like your deepest feelings, inside there. When you figure that out, you're going to discover, man, this is the lie. You're going to discover your true identity. Now, I think this second theory actually holds quite a bit more of our current cultural imagination than the first one does, at least for the time being. I think we've kind of seen through maybe the prosperity piece, but this one still is holding people a lot of captive. It sounds something like, maybe you've heard somebody say this, they get to this point in their life, they're like, you know what, I'm done living someone else's life. I'm done being what everybody else tells me to be. I'm done with my marriage. I'm done with anything that's going to influence me. I got to go deep inside of me because I lost myself, man. I got to get down to my deepest desires, my truest me. I got to find that. And then I have to be true to that. I have to be true to who I really am. Right? This is kind of the language that you hear when somebody goes through this crisis and they're like, I just got to let go of all this external stuff. I just got to dig deep inside of me. What do I want? What are my desires? Right? Here's the big assumption that is being made with that statement. This assumption has no evidence to it, ever, not scientific evidence, not even practical evidence in a lot of ways. The assumption is that, that somewhere deep inside of you, you are going to find this bedrock of coherent desires. Like that there is no, everything is very steady, everything is very constant. If you can just dig deep enough underneath all of maybe the external chaos and conflict that we have, our external emotions and desires, underneath all that, you just got to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Deep down inside of you, there's this bedrock of solid identity. You just got to get down to that. The assumption is that that's down there somewhere. Let me just ask you a question. When has that ever happened for anybody? Has anybody ever gotten so deep inside, they're like, oh, I know exactly who I am, and there's no conflict inside of me. Like this, I am what I feel. I am what I feel. I just have to dig deep enough to get it. And I won't find any more contradictory feelings. Now listen, forget the psychology for just a second. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a biblical principle. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite passages, if you have a Bible, you want to turn to Romans chapter 7. This is one of my favorite passages because Paul's just so doggone human, he's just here's what it is. And he talks about his own life, his own walk, and he just shows this conflict. Even deep down inside of him, there's this conflict. So I put it on your sermon notes for him. I'm just going to read a couple of verses from Romans 7, verse 14. He says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am under the flesh, sold under sin. For I do not understand my own actions." Anybody else kind of relate to that statement? I don't know. I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Skip to verse 18. He says, "For I know nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep doing." I don't know if anybody else can relate to that in their life. That's me. This is showing something very biblical about us, that we are both flesh and spirit. And the flesh and the spirit are constantly at war with each other. And even if you get down to the very bottom of things, you're going to find that your flesh is still at war with your spirit. I think that's going to be something that follows us all the way to the other side, or before stops when we make the transition to the other side, and we won't have that problem anymore. But you just think about some of the conflicts that we go through as human beings. You think about somebody starting off in life, maybe goes to college, gets a degree, and then they get to this point, and they're like, well, do I want a career or do I want family? You know, those two things are going to be kind of constantly a little bit warring with each other. So what do you want to do? And some people are very fine saying, oh, you know what, I can get rid of the career. I can get rid of the career and I can just pursue my family. But there's always going to be sort of this, like, maybe that's something I can go back to someday. Or you think about just the conflicting desires that you have inside. I want to eat cookies and I want to lose weight. Right? I mean, like, this is just like bedrock me. It's just like there's always this conflicting desire. I want to read my Bible and I want to watch Fox News more. Oh, yeah, you know what I'm talking to. Like down deep, even deep, our feelings are just as much at war as they are on the surface. They're just as much as war down. There's no single coherent strain of desires. You could just find it. You would find your identity. I am what I feel. It's a lie. It's a cultural lie, and it messes us up because we're constantly told to just dig deeper. Find your feelings. Find your feelings. Remember what it means to have an identity. It means to have some consistency. It means to have some sameness about us. Your feelings can't be your identity because depending on your age, depending on the time period, depending on the situation, your feelings are going to change. Your feelings are going to contradict themselves. You just think about asking your teenage self a question that your adult self knows. You know, it's like that teenager was weird, didn't have it. Sorry to you teenagers in the room. Sorry about that. I think this has been one of the primary identity lies that we have been told, especially in regards to the gay and the transgender movements. I was reading about a 15-year-old kid kind of considering a sex change surgery, kind of considering the hormone therapy, all the things that go along with that. And it was his mom and some sort of a therapist or psychologist was sitting with him. And the question that they kept going to over and over and over didn't have anything to do with this other than one idea, and that it was, are you sure this is what you really want? And you see, you can hear that language. It's kind of like this idea, like are you sure you're down deep enough into who you really are, into what you really want? That's where your identity is, down low. So are you sure are you sure this is what you really want? Are you sure you're at the bedrock of your feelings and that there is a consistency down there? Because if you've gotten deep enough and you know this is what you really want, then by all means. But I'm standing in front of you today as your pastor, and I'm telling you, your feelings are not to be trusted almost ever. The heart is deceitful above all things. Recently, there was a pediatrician. Her name is Hillary Cass. She's not a Christian, which I think makes this even more compelling. She is a leading pediatrician in England's National Health Services, and she published a paper. It's called the Cass Review. And if you get a chance, I'll give some information in your bulletin about it. It just came out April of 2024, so not too long ago. commissioned by the Royal College of Pediatrics, and they said they charged her to do an independent review of gender identity services for children and for young people. And I've talked about this a little bit in the past, so it might sound a little bit familiar, but one of her conclusions from this report, an independent review, again, not a Christian, she's just looking at this massive data and making conclusions. She says the exploration of identity is a natural process during childhood and adolescence that rarely requires clinical input or medical intervention. She says it usually does not need that sort of a thing. Gender dysphoria, remember that sort of unsettled feeling within your given sex, your given gender. Gender dysphoria in childhood is not a reliable predictor for adult identification. Usually gender dysphoria ceases and people embrace their biological sex. Okay? In other words, all she's doing is she's just saying, she's exposing the assumption that if we can just get down to our deepest feelings, then you'll find out who you really are. The truth is that who we really are is constant, especially the way we feel, is constantly in flux. It's constantly changing. It doesn't matter if you're young or you're old. I'm going to tell you right now, again, your feelings are not a reliable source for your identity. Right? Culture's been telling us this a lot more lately. I've been saying you just need to figure out who you are. You need to figure out your feelings, and then you'll know who you are. They're not consistent enough. So, first cultural theory of identity is that you are what you can acquire, what you can gather. Second cultural theory of identity is you are what you feel. The third theory of identity is going to be the one that blows all the other ones out of the water. And this is relatively new. We'll kind of wrap things up with this one, but it's just probably the last 5 to 10 years where we've really heard this coming out and gaining a lot of steam. You guys can help me work through that timeline, but that makes sense. This is, I think, the least biblical of all the theories, but in some ways maybe the most logically consistent. Cultural theory number 3, I am whatever I say I am. Right? I am whatever I say I am. In other words, there is nothing external to me that is going to determine me. Right? I am what I say I am. Sounds a little like somebody in the Old Testament. I am who I am. This is a God move. This is a move to take the place of God. In fact, in this theory, God doesn't have any place. There's nothing external. And the other two, maybe you could have some sort of semblance of God. God maybe wouldn't like it, but you are what you acquire, you are what you feel. All right, if you want to believe in God, that's fine. Maybe though you can kind of hold those in together. This one doesn't have any room for God. There's nothing external. There's no moral standard. There's no moral input from the outside. There's nothing external. Even your feelings, like theory number 2, even your feelings are too external. Like it doesn't matter what you feel. You should be able to do whatever you want to do. Even your feelings are too external. As a matter of fact, pardon my French here, but reading from a guy on Reddit, he said, my feelings can go to hell. I am whatever I say I am. And I'm only using that to, first of all, because it's in the Bible, but secondly, because that's probably as close to the Bible as this guy is ever going to get, having some understanding of hell. But you can't talk about any other source that you're going to have to discover. Like that there's some truth out there. Maybe it's your feelings, maybe it's God, maybe it's some sort of moral code. Identity is never discovered. Recently, the way we're thinking about identity is that identity is always constructed. It is whatever you say it is. In fact, a lot of this has even been on a collision course with some of the people who hold to identity theory number 2, where they say, hey, you just got to get in touch with your deepest feelings. Matter of fact, kind of the old school gay pride movement held that theory number 2. They said, listen, you just got to dig deep inside of you. You're going to find out who you are. Man, if you have these feelings inside of you, then that's who you are. You've found something in there that you really need to submit to. It's kind of this first attempt to turn sexuality into an identity. But this theory number 3, takes it to another whole level. Because to say you're gay only because you feel that way, well, that's a little bit oppressive. That's a little bit restrictive. That's putting some sort of an external identity on it that we don't even need. It's too restrictive. It's too confining. What if we just said, I'm gay because I want to be gay? Because I can just construct that sort of a thing. So they're even pushing back, saying, don't say those sorts of things, like you have to feel gay in order to say you're gay. You don't have to do that. You can be whatever you want to be. To say that you have to submit to any kind of sexuality or any kind of other thing is just some sort of an oppression, to think that there's some particular self that you're going to have to try to discover. All self is created, it is constructed, and it is chosen. I am whoever I say I am. No one should say that there's an essential self that we have to submit to. There's even categories in this new way of thinking, and it's still kind of a blossoming idea, but you'll hear it more and more in some of the language that you see being used by people who are Christian. And if you think about this, you know that ideas have consequences. And so this is what we're seeing kind of coming out. I'll go back to a quote from a guy named Michel Foucault, who was back in the 70s and 80s. He was a French deconstructionist, and he had this idea, and now we're seeing it sort of play itself out in this radical sense of freedom. He says maybe the target nowadays is not to discover what we are, discover what we are, but to refuse what we are, right? So there's this sense of like freedom here, like nobody's going to tell me anything. There's nothing that is going to determine who I am other than this. But it's not just freedom, it's kind of this malicious freedom. And while it's consistent logically, at least, there's no God, there's nothing out there, it's also terrifying. Because you start to play the consequences of this kind of thinking out, and everything is absolutely random. It can be whatever you want. It's terrifying, and it's an impossible way to live in a society. It's an absolutely impossible way. If you watched things like Fury Road or Furiosa, these movies, or Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, that's the kind of society that you get with this kind of thinking. It's not a society that anybody wants to be a part of, because imagine a world where you can never make a claim against someone else's identity choice. Like they say whatever they want, you can never make any sort of claim against that. It could be a good choice, a bad choice, a right choice, a wrong choice, because the minute you make the claim, you have to contradict your own belief. The minute you put any kind of value on someone else's claim, you have to contradict your own belief, and you just can't live that way. It's an inconsistent way to live, because you have these two competing identity choices, and to say one is wrong and one is right, it doesn't work in this kind of ideology. I am whatever I say I am. Somebody says, I want to identify as a murderer. So I want to identify as a living person. So who's going to win on this? There's like this inconsistency. It's terrifying, because if you do start to live consistently, then we're going to find ourselves in a world of cruelty beyond imagination. If there's no, just go here with me for just a second to think about this idea that there is no external morality. There is no way that things should be. There are no boundaries on anything. You start to play a world like that out, even in your imagination, and you think the sky is the limit on the kind of unholy terror that is going to rain down on this world if we start to think in that kind of a way, right? So we have these three theories kind of promoted by culture, different times, different places, and you can kind of see where they go. I think in some ways, every one of us should be able to see a little bit of that pulling at our own hearts and lives. I am what I acquire. It's too external. It's too superficial. It doesn't work. We end up losing ourselves in the process. I am what I feel is too internal, because there's no like bedrock down there that you can get to that is going to help you understand your identity. It's going to be shifting and moving and shaking all the time. I am what I feel, and I am whatever I want to be, leads to this violent world where there is no boundaries, where there is no external anything to keep a society in check. We're going to talk next week a little bit more about this idea of freedom, this idea of Christian freedom. We know Jesus came and he said, for freedom, I have set you free, right? So there is a sense of freedom. God has given us the freedom to choose, to see, to understand our own identity. But as Christians, we live with that freedom in a different way than maybe anybody else in culture is going to live. And we are going to deliberately submit ourselves. This is why the beginning of our identity has to start with you have a creator. You are given dignity and purpose, and your part of your plan is to submit yourself under his hand. Amen? So we choose to submit our freedom even to him.